Chapter 1. From Ethnic Myth to Civil Imaginary. Hans Kohn, a Zionist of Czech-German background who began to despair of Jewish nationalism, left mandatory Palestine for the United States at the end of the 1920s. There he became, along with Carlton Hayes, one of the fathers of the academic study of nationalism. His youth in Eastern Europe, where he had fought in the First World War, along with his experiences and disillusion in the Zionist colonialist enterprise and his migration to New York, equipped him with more valuable first-hand data than his colleague Hayes possessed. He, too, was a captive of the essentialist premise that peoples and nations had always existed, and he, too, assumed that only the national consciousness was a novel phenomenon, that had to be interpreted in the context of modernization. Thus, much of his writing belongs to the history of ideas, though it includes a cautious attempt to make use of socio-political history as well. His crucial contribution to the study of nationalism was his pioneering effort to map its different expressions. Kohn began writing on the issue of nationalism back in the 1920s, but it was only in his comprehensive study The Idea of Nationalism, published in 1944, that he formulated his famous theory of dichotomy, which won him many supporters as well as many opponents. If the First World War pointed him toward the study of nationalism, it was the Second World War that determined his political and ideological sensibilities and, in effect, determined his scholarly achievement. Kohn saw nationalism as made up of two dominant categories: Western nationalism, with an essentially voluntarist approach, which developed on either side of the Atlantic Ocean, bounded on the east by Switzerland, and the organic national identity that spread eastward from the Rhine, encompassing Germany, Poland, the Ukraine and Russia. Nationalism in the West, except in Ireland, is an original phenomenon that sprang from autochthonous socio-political forces, without outside intervention. In most cases it appears when the state, which is engaged in modernization, is well established, or is being established. This nationalism draws its ideas from the traditions of the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment, and its principles are based on individualism and liberalism, both legal and political. The hegemonic class that engenders this national consciousness is a powerful, secular bourgeoisie, and it constructs civil institutions with political power that play a decisive role in the formation of a liberal democracy. It is a self-confident bourgeoisie, and the national politics it fosters tend generally toward openness and inclusiveness. Becoming a citizen of the United States, Britain, France, the Netherlands or Switzerland depends not only on origin and birth but also on the will to join. For all the differences between national perceptions, anyone naturalized in these countries is seen, legally and ideologically, as a member of the nation, with the state as the common property of the citizenry. According to Kohn, the nationalism that developed in Central and Eastern Europe, the Czech case being something of an exception, was, by contrast, a historical product catalyzed principally from outside. It came into being during Napoleon's conquests and began to take shape as a movement of resistance against the ideas and progressive values of the Enlightenment. In these countries, the national idea arose before, and in fact unconnected with, the consolidation of a modern state apparatus. In these political cultures the middle classes were weak, and the civil institutions they founded were deferential toward the central, and aristocratic authorities. The national identity they embraced was hesitant, it lacked confidence. As a result, it rested on kinship and ancient origin, and defined the nation as a rigid, organically exclusive entity. The national philosophies that flourished in the lands of the future state of Germany, of Poland to be, and of Russia, exclusive property of the Tsars, were reactionary and irrational. They foreshadowed the political tendencies that would develop in these regions. The mystique of blood and soil characterized German nationalism, much as conservative romanticism animated the national ferment in the Slav countries of Eastern Europe. Henceforth it would be impossible to join the emerging nations, because they were perceived as exclusive ethno-biological or ethno-religious entities. The boundaries of the nation were congruent with the ethnic boundaries, which could not be entered at will. Such was the unmistakable historical product of this identity politics. Cohn's dichotomic theory, broadly sketched above without its finer nuances, was without doubt fundamentally normative and born chiefly in reaction to the rise of Nazism. The immigrant, who had already passed through several cultures and national movements, regarded the collective super-identity of the United States, his final refuge, as the highest realization of the universalistic aims that animated Western culture. By contrast, Germany and the East represented the terminus of all the myths and legends about ancient collectives, organic and ethnicist. Certainly Cohn's idealization of the American concept of citizenship, and Anglo-Saxon nationalism in general does not withstand present-day criticism, and so not unexpectedly found a good many opponents. But the criticism of Cohn's theory may be broadly classified as of two kinds. One noted his excessively schematic division and pointed out empirical weaknesses in its historical descriptions but did not reject the essential elements of his analysis. The other entirely rejected the fundamental basis of his distinction between political civil and ethnic organic nationalisms, with implicit apologetics for the latter. In reality, an analysis of the development of Western societies, which Cohn classified as civil, voluntarist, inclusive nations, the United States, Britain, France, the Netherlands, reveals tensions and struggles among diverse tendencies. Throughout the 19th century, Protestant Anglo-Saxon identity formed the principal focus of American nationalism, so that Native Americans, Asian and Eastern European immigrants, and black African slaves often experienced hostility and strong identity anxieties. In the 1940s, when Cohn was writing his pioneering book, black citizens had not yet been imagined as an imminent part of the great democratic nation. Although the British have always been proud of their mixed origins, Norman, Scandinavian, and so on, at the height of the liberal British Empire political thinkers and leaders saw the inborn English character as the source of its greatness, and their attitude toward the inhabitants of the colonies was always contemptuous. Many Britons took pride in their Anglo-Saxon heritage, and viewed the Welsh and the Irish of pure Celtic origin as their inferiors, races alien to the chosen Christian people. In the course of the 19th century, during which national identity crystallized throughout the West, there were always Frenchmen who described themselves as direct descendants of the Gallic tribes, bolstering their hostility toward the Germans within the framework of the eternal struggle against the Frankish tribes invading from the east. At the same time, we find in Central and Eastern Europe not a few thinkers, currents and movements that sought to devise an open, inclusive identity politics, bounded not by ethno-biological or ethno-religious but by cultural and political boundaries. In Germany, the central object of Cohn's dichotomic model, there was not only the ethnocentric national tradition, whose outstanding ideologists were Heinrich von Treitschke and Werner Sombart. There were also cosmopolitan writers such as Friedrich von Schiller and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, national liberals such as Theodor Mommsen and Max Weber, as well as the great social democratic mass movement that viewed Germanity as a hospitable culture and saw all who lived within its territory as its inherent parts. Similarly, in Tsarist Russia it was not only the various socialist movements that took the inclusive political position that anyone who saw oneself as a Russian must be regarded as such, but also liberal currents and broad intellectual strata that regarded Jews, Ukrainians and Belarusians as integral parts of the great nation. Nevertheless, Cohn's primary intuition was correct and to the point. In the early phases of every Western nation, indeed in every emerging national ideology, ethnocentric myths surround the dominant cultural and linguistic group revered as the original people race. But in Western societies, for all their subtle variations, these myths fade, though they are never quite extinguished, slowly giving way to a complex of ideas and sensibilities that hold every citizen and naturalized immigrant to be integral parts of the nation. At some point, the hegemonic culture comes to see itself as belonging to all members of the nation, and the dominant identity aspires to encompass them all. This inclusive democratization is not an unbroken process, it experiences regressions and deviations, as well as political upheavals in times of instability and crisis. Yet despite such setbacks, all the liberal democracies have given rise to an imagined citizenship in which the future is more significant than the past. This imagined concept has been translated into legal norms and eventually permeates the state educational systems. This took place through the 19th and 20th centuries in the Anglo-Saxon countries, the Low Countries, France, and Switzerland. Not that racism vanished from these societies, or that contempt and conflict between different sectors within them ceased. But the processes of integration, sometimes through the absorption of divergent parts, sometimes by their suppression, were perceived as necessary, even as desirable. If hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue, then citizenship nationalism is the relatively open culture in which the racist, or the excluding ethnicist, is always forced to apologize. By contrast, in Germany, Poland, Lithuania, the Ukraine and Russia, despite considerable movements supporting a definition of national identity on the political basis of citizenship, it was the groups that continue to cultivate myths about an ancient homogeneous origin that carried the day. Such old concepts about a rigid ethnic entity that remained unchanged through history, a genealogy of a primeval and unique people, effectively barred anyone from joining the nation or, for that matter, from quitting it. Hence, Germans or Poles and their offspring in the United States would remain forever, in the eyes of nationalists, members of the German, or the Polish nation. The Gallic tribes were depicted in the French educational system as a kind of historical metaphor. Even the children of immigrants repeated at school that their ancestors were Gauls. And their teachers took pride in these new descendants, whereas the Teutonic Knights, or the ancient Aryan tribes, increasingly became toward the end of the 19th century the idealized forebears of the modern Germans. Whoever was not considered a descendant of theirs was not regarded as a true German. Similarly, in the Poland that arose after the First World War, whoever had not been conceived in a purely Catholic womb, who happened to be the child of Jews, Ukrainians or Ruthenians, even if a citizen, was not regarded as a member of the noble, long-suffering Polish nation. Likewise, to many Slavophiles, subjects who had not been born within the bosom of the Orthodox Church and were not authentic Slavs were therefore not part of the Holy Russian people and were not to be included within Greater Russia. The life of linguistic or religious minorities in these countries was immeasurably harder than in the West, even if we leave to one side for the moment the pogroms against Jews in Russia, and the murderous campaigns of the Nazis. It is enough to look at the character of the national entities that arose after the collapse of Yugoslavia, and the fragile criteria for membership in them, to perceive the connection between ethno-religious definitions and the outburst of intercommunal xenophobia. These entities resorted to almost extinct religion in order to assert their national ethnos, which had never had much of an existence. It was only the use of ancient, and utterly fictitious, myths that made it possible to set Catholic Croatians against Orthodox Serbs, and these in an especially vicious way against Muslim Bosnians and Kosovars. Following the failure of the former communist regime's integrative policies, minute cultural and linguistic differences turned into exclusionary walls. Until the final decade of the 20th century, Germany and Eastern Europe remained dominated by persistent ethnicist nationalism. Cultural and linguistic minorities, even when in possession of citizenship, were still not included in the dominant public consciousness within the national boundaries. Locally born second and even third generation immigrants were not granted citizenship. Yet ethnic Germans who had lived for generations in the East, in some cases since the Middle Ages, and who had lost all cultural and linguistic connection with any kind of Germanity, still had the privilege of becoming German citizens anytime they wished. Only as the European community grew, and traditional nationalism somewhat declined, did ethnocentric identities begin to weaken in Central and Eastern Europe, as it silently submitted to the requirements of full democratic citizenship in the new, unified Europe. It must not be forgotten that ethnicist nationalism meant that democracy, namely, government representing the entire population equally, was always imperfect because not all citizens were held to be legitimate members of the national body. The historical origin of this difference lies in the unresolved division between the process that matured into a political nationalism based on citizenship, which one could call citizenship nationalism, as opposed to a nationalism based on an allegiance to ethnicity, which one could call ethnic nationalism. Unfortunately, Hans Kohne's explanations were not entirely satisfactory. For example, Italy's unification came late, paralleling that of Germany, and, as in Germany, the weak middle class did not accelerate its nationalization. In both countries national movements arose some time before actual unification, and in both it was the monarchies, rather than bourgeois strata with mass support, that created the states. Yet in Germany it was the ethnic, or ethno-biological, version of nationalism that triumphed, while in Italy by the end of the 19th century the political citizenship version had won. The difficulty in understanding this contrast can be further highlighted by comparing the later movements, German National Socialism and Italian Fascism. Both were strongly nationalistic, and among their various projects was popular unification, which had not been fully accomplished by the monarchies. Both movements were authoritarian, both viewed the nation as a collective greater than the sum of its parts, the individuals of which it was composed, and both despised Western individualism. But National Socialism adopted the ethno-biological heritage on which it had been nurtured from the start, whereas Italian Fascism continued to draw, at least until 1938, on the inclusive political nationalism of Italy's legendary founders, Giuseppe Mazzini and Giuseppe Garibaldi. German speakers in northern Italy, Jews in the urban centers, and Croatians annexed by war were all perceived as parts of the Italian nation, or future members of it. Even the historian Hobsbawm's interesting chronological classification is only partially convincing. He noted that the nationalist phenomenon had two hues. The first appeared during the revolutionary era of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, bearing liberal democratic characteristics. The latter surged in a new form at the end of the 19th, based on reactionary ethno-linguistic and racist markers. While it is true that toward the end of that century the processes of urbanization and migration in Eastern Europe intensified, and the friction between them produced resentment and racism, Hobsbawm's analysis cannot account for the German development. Moreover, Greece, which attained national independence in the first half of the 19th century and won the sympathy of all the Democrats and liberals in Europe at that time, preserved almost to the end of the 20th century its rigid ethno-religious nationalism. By contrast, the nature of Italian nationalism, which matured later, was quite political and citizen-focused. Likewise, Czech nationalism, resulting in a nation-state, together with the Slovaks, that was attained only after the First World War, displayed a certain inclusiveness, though not toward German speakers, which was quite rare among the other nationalities that arose with the fall of the Habsburgs. Leah Greenfeld, a noted scholar in the field of nationalism, as a child she emigrated from the USSR to Israel, and then left it to further her academic career in the United States, has tackled the issue with the tools of comparative sociology borrowed from Max Weber. She accepted in broad terms the division between citizenship and ethnic nationalism, but chose to include the collectivist touchstone. If Britain and the United States are individualistic states, the state of France, born from the Great Revolution, linked civil identity with reverence for the body politic. Hence its culture is more homogeneous and less tolerant and liberal toward resident minorities than that of its Western neighbors. However, the countries between the Rhine and Moscow developed a more problematic nationalism, being both collectivist and ethnicist. In these countries the nation is seen as an unchangeable primeval body, to which people can belong only by virtue of genetic inheritance. For Greenfeld, the difference between the strategies of national identity formation was caused principally by the character of the historical subject responsible for them. In the West, broad social strata adopted and internalized the national consciousness. In England, it was the minor aristocracy and the fairly literate urban population. In North America, the generality of settlers, and in France, the strong bourgeoisie. In the East, however, quite narrow strata led the way in the adoption of nationalism. In the Germanic cultural world it was small circles of intellectuals who sought a rise in status at the heart of the conservative social hierarchy, while in Russia it was the weak aristocracy that adopted a new modern identity through which it hoped to preserve its remaining privileges. The prolonged isolation of the groups who created Eastern nationalism was largely responsible for its exclusivity, and its persistent attachment to a mythological past. Other scholars have proposed further explanations for the disparate kinds of national temperament that produced such different histories in Europe and worldwide. According to Gellner, in the West it did not take many broken eggs to make the national omelette. Thanks to the long existence of a high culture, only a few moderate corrections were needed to define the national boundaries. But the East, given its general disarray, had no such long-standing high culture, hence the need felt by a particular cultural and linguistic group to forcibly modify the body politic through the use of exclusion, expulsion, even the physical annihilation of other cultural groups. Here, too, Gellner's analysis, like Hobsbawm's, fails to fit the Germanic world. Although it had a high culture ever since the Reformation, outright ethnocentric nationalism ultimately won. Roger Brubaker, an American sociologist who conducted a thorough methodical comparison between the development of nationhood in France and in Germany, also concluded that the complex mosaic of, and sharp frictions between, cultural linguistic groups on the Germanic-Slavic frontiers were among the main causes of their differences. For a long time, there had not been a strong nation-state capable of Germanizing Poles and others who lived among speakers of German dialects. Nor did a revolutionary regime arise, as in France, capable of unifying all the ethnic Germans surrounded by other linguistically defined cultures. To this day, no agreed synthesis has been proposed that accounts for the spectrum of national expressions and for their development over the past 2 centuries. Socioeconomic, psychological and demographic factors, geographic location, even political and historical contingencies, the explanations remain partial and incomplete. Nor has a satisfactory answer been found thus far to the question of why certain nations preserved ethnocentric myths for a long time and used these in their self-definition, while other nations grew up relatively fast and so succeeded in establishing mature democracies. It appears that further research is required, as well as additional empirical findings. A primeval ancestral identity, an image of a biological genealogy, and the idea of a chosen people/race did not spring up in a vacuum. For the consolidation of a national consciousness, civil or ethnocentric, it was always necessary to have a literate elite. To enable the nation to remember and consolidate its historical imagery, it required the services of scholarly producers of culture, masters of memory, creators of laws and constitutions. While diverse social strata utilized or derived various advantages from the rise of the nation-state, the central agents in the formation of national entities, those who perhaps derived the greatest symbolic profit from them, were, above all, the intellectuals.